I have a preaching and teaching practice which is post-colonial, because I live in that setting. And thinking about these things, my mind went back to an experience where we had a wonderful multicultural service in St. Croix. And the preacher was a man who had been described to me as some sort of a Billy Graham. And somebody said to me, if you just close your eyes, you think you're hearing Billy Graham. And I think that that is part of the problem. I'm using that image to say that that is part of the problem. If you close your eyes in the Caribbean, you feel that you're somewhere else, and that the sermon could have been preached in Minnesota or New Zealand this year or 100 years ago. So, departing from that point of view, I go on to say something that some people will find a little explosive, which is that the 3-point on a poem sermon, the traditional deductive sermon, is a colonial vestige. And it is very easy to spot in Latin America, because Spurgeon and Brodus are still used in most conservative Bible institute and poor Bible colleges because they're affordable. You can find them anyway. And a lot of us studied with those books. I studied with one that rehashed Brodus' theory into a bit more contextual Latin American point of view, but it was as convoluted as the former. The only thing that he added was tongue twisters to help you develop your patterns of diction, because Crane had been a missionary in Mexico. So my contention with that sermon is that it's deductive, is monological, is rationalistic, is individualistic, and foremost is authoritarian, because it presents the minister as the authority and affirms or implies that the congregation is in a subaltern position where the only thing that they can do is assent to something that is a truth presented by an authority, and the only thing that they have to do is to apply such truth. So in that sense, I say in page 5, in short, traditional deductive preaching is colonial preaching. The persistence of this preaching style in the Caribbean transcends personal preferences, for traditional deductive preaching is an ideological expression of colonialism. And I go to explore how that collides with our worship, and how our worship, particularly in Pentecostal churches, is subversive, and how you break all the rules that you learn in seminary, and you develop your own practice. And instead of having that delivery that is very calm, and that delivery that is very European, you have a delivery where people scream and shout and run here and there. But the fact is that that is part of our enthusiasm for preaching. So in that sense, I say that there is a clash that is evident between our worship style and the homiletic theory that we have been taught. So I call for a deconstruction of the traditional sermon. And I call to the creation, to the development of myriad new preaching forms that would include the interview, that would include narrative preaching, that would include the drama, that would include poetry, that would include music, that would include now the use of video, interviews, dialogues. Okay. Now, this is much more difficult than it sounds, because in the Caribbean we're totally divided. First of all, the colonial powers divided us by language. So you have the English-speaking Caribbean, you have the French-speaking Caribbean, then you have the Spanish-speaking Caribbean. But also you have other languages like Dutch that's still spoken in some islands, and things like the patois in Jamaica that I don't speak, and Creole, where I can say a couple of words, because Creole is French spoken with English grammar. Why? Because the Americans occupied Haiti for over 30 years. So, for example, in French, you say, je mange, tu manges, il mange, nous mangeons, vous mangez. In English, you know that the verb doesn't change. In Creole, you say, j'ai mangé, tu mangé, il mangé, nous mangé. So it's English grammar applied to French. And it's a very difficult language to master. And a very young language. Actually, one of the developers of that language, Jean-Claude Barjot, was my teacher of literature in Puerto Rico. And he opened my eyes to that. And one of the things that he did is that he assigned me to read a little book by Aimé Césaire, who was the mayor of Fort-de-France in Martinique. And Césaire wrote a little book called, a little poem, actually it's a long poem, it's a little book called Memories on My Return to My Native Country. Le Cahier du Retour au Pays Natal. And he says something very interesting. We are so colonized that even to insult our colonizers, we have to do it in their language. Even to insult the French, we have to do it in French. I come from the oldest colony in America, which is Puerto Rico. And we have the privilege of insulting our current masters in our former master's language, which is Spanish. But the point is that we need to transcend that and begin to forge a homiletic from the Caribbean. One last thing that I want to say, the rest you can read, is that most of the relationships between all these three parts of the Caribbean are mediated through the states and the colonial powers. We have no relationship between the Theological Seminary of the West Indies in Jamaica and the Evangelical Seminary of Puerto Rico. I just learned that there's a new seminary in Haiti, and the key developer of that seminary has been a guy who lives in Indiana. Because he's a former missionary, he works for the Disciples of Christ. So you see all these relationships, you know, where I had to be assigned by a school in Boston, in Massachusetts, Gordon Conwell, to go to Jamaica. And I met Lewin Williams, vice president of the seminary in Jamaica, when he was my teacher in Atlanta. And I spoke to a group of Asian pastors in my French that I have mostly forgotten a couple of months ago in New York. So we need to develop relationships from the English-speaking Caribbean to the Spanish-speaking Caribbean to the French-speaking Caribbean. And we need to forge a whole bunch of stuff. But most of it is a homiletic that comes out from lo cotidiano, from our daily life. And a preaching, a homiletic practice that responds to our reality so that we can read the Bible in life and the life in the Bible. La Biblia en la vida y la vida en la Biblia.